So let me start, dear EUI friends, by taking you back to last March in Oxford, where I live, and when I felt compelled to write a public letter to my British friends, which started thus. My kids and husbands are singular. My kids and husband are British. I teach and pay taxes in this country, talk to my village neighbors every day, and love English court country lanes, Scottish castles, Welsh road signs, Cornwall's gardens, and all the bloody rest of it. As a French and Greek citizen, I won't have a vote in this referendum, and yet this is one of the most momentous decisions that will ever be taken in my name as a European citizen living on this side of the Channel. So, along with the 2 million other EU expats living here, and millions on the continent who feel passionate about Britain's European vocation, all I can do is plead, dear British friends, please stay. I'm told by my student that the letter went viral, which was apparent to me from the many hundreds of abusive comments encouraging me to leave and just go home, and I'm not giving you the non-polite version of these comments. So you can see that I come to you today with some baggage, and also a recognition that each and every one of you in this room has our own way to relate to Brexit, as a citizen, as an individual, and as a scholar. So when we are hit with the unexpected, we first have to process raw feelings of shock, followed by elation or awe, anger, denial, despair, bitterness, depending on what the unexpected does for you, a catastrophe or a miracle. But after we've plodded through the 5 stages of grief, what happens? What happens next? Well, hey, we are who we are. We rationalize, give reason a go at dealing with what happened. We turn to the past, trying to explain, why did this happen? Or to the future, what will happen, predictions and prescriptions. Now, today, in contrast, what I'd like to discuss with you is meaning. Meanings matter, I argue, for which narrative dominates the next 2 years and decade will determine not only the nature of the Brexit deal, which grants us with headlines every day, but also, I would argue, the nature of the EU itself. Clearly, what does leaving the EU actually means is up for grabs. Only Algeria, let's not forget, and Iceland have accomplished it before, but in radically different circumstances. So, meaning is not explanation, although explanations usually feed it. And it's not implication, although it feeds them. Instead, meaning is about making sense together, in the full senses of the word, making apparent to our senses what is there. As Roland Barthes famously argued, we are sustained by socially shared stories, which form the implicit background to our common norms and expectations, amorphous assemblage, as he said, which often cluster around certain narratives. And when hidden narratives surface, they invoke the quality often of past fantastic tales, which help determine what we see. Barthes called these narratives myths. So today I would like to argue in the Barthian mode. Hey, I'm French after all, maybe cosmopolitan, but I can't hide it. For the special power of archetypal myths, to help us elucidate the meaning of these bombshells in the European landscape, which we call Brexit. So when I say archetypal myths, I refer to 3. Stories of banishment, which give us a here and a there, a judge and a culprit. Stories, second, of reckoning, whereby terrible past misdeeds will not come to pass without consequences. Consequences whose ripple reach far beyond the original source. And thirdly, stories of sacrifice, which extract the good from the bad. Now, all these kinds of archetypal stories pivot around a moment, a before and an after, and they all somehow connect a feature of being and a feature of doing, where the doing is being done by or to someone. And it's in the making of this connection between the being and the doing, making this connection visible, that the moment acquires meaning, allowing for an infinite retelling in infinite circumstances, and yet serving as a stable beacon of our collective imagination. But yet, of course, life is not so simple. True meanings are never given, always ambiguous. Each label, not a single meaning, but a constellation of meanings, and intuition opening up more questions, like an ever-retreating truth mirage. Who here will not be turned on by a meaning that's hard to get? This is a room of scholars, after all. And so, when we talk of myths of banishment, is banishment a curse or a blessing? A humiliation or a badge of honor? Is it not anyway always one way or another self-banishment? If you have not sought it, you have at least earned it. And is it all about a prison you leave, or is banishment a prison you enter? Now, what about myths of reckoning? If reckoning is the collective price for an unintentional or intentional deed, how collective must it be? If we're talking last judgment, full-blown Armageddon, who will be around to hear fate's "I told you so"? What is the point of Oedipus's blinding if he cannot see? Why conjure up a re-knowing if not to allow for a second chance? So here we have all these myths of reckoning, which contain more questions than answer. And what of sacrifice? If a myth tells us about sacrifice, is the sacrifice real? You know, Christ, after all, came back to life and got to hang out with his dad for eternity. Sources disagree on whether Iphigenia, pictured here in the great Italian way, was replaced by a goat, literally by an escaped goat at the last moment and in the shadows, when she was up for sacrifice to let Greek troops sail to Troy. The myth gives us a quantum superposition. She gets to not reunite with her brother Orestes, and much follows. We never know if the sacrifice is real. And does the chosen scapegoat absorb everyone else's sins, or on the contrary, exposes them for all to see in our sacrificial myths? And whoever sacrifice it is the sacrifice not always in vain in these stories? Yes, the wind did rise to carry Agamemnon's ship to Troy after the disappearance of Iphigenia and her sacrifice, but they did not end up winning the battle. Or rather, they won the battle, but did they win the war? There are not many triumphant welcomes home in the Odyssey, are they? So it's important to the meanings at stake that these questions remain unresolved. It will be important to the meanings of Brexit that our questions remain unresolved. Now, you may ask, meaning for whom? And I will not ascribe specific meanings to particular tribes, partly because I prefer not to belabor the obvious, but partly because to retain plausible deniability is a good idea, and mostly because my point is precisely because the equation between certain types of people, the French or the poor or the left behind, and meanings they ascribe to things is tenuous and fluid, as meanings get reinterpreted and negotiated over time. So, to be sure, for some, one and only one meaning will come to define who they are. But for many others, we may hold several meanings in our head, and these meanings may be contradictory with one another. Now, I do find it useful, and I would hope you do too, to simplify in one way and ask about dominant meanings among three subsets of people when we talk about Brexit: the Brits, the Europeans, and the rest of the world. So, as promised in the blurb for this talk, I will translate my three archetypal myths into semantics, much more arbitrarily associated with our European story, with our European field, with our European integration scholarship, namely exceptionalism, skepticism, and pluralism. Now, sorry. Now, in doing so, I would love to be capable of taking God's eye view or the eagle's eye view as a good rooted cosmopolitan, Bridget, but can we individually claim to see from an enlarged vantage point, as Kant would have us do? In truth, I have my preferred take too. I can't hide that. And I will argue that the three stories, the three myths and applications of meanings for Brexit must be woven together, but that none of them is internally coherent. And that my hope is that the third, the pluralist story of sacrifice, can survive the war of narratives by both drawing on the other two and transcending them. But I have no doubt, as we discussed earlier, that in some sense it is the poor, most vulnerable narrative of them all. Alex. So, the most straightforward and perhaps most widely shared meaning of Brexit is simply that it's a very British thing indeed, and therefore, well, just a British problem. Self-banishment from the EU is in character, as it were, and we should look no further for meaning than to British exceptionalism. Now, of course, we could discuss later in Q&A if it's English or British exceptionalism. But for the moment, we can agree that what this had meant to the country's very special relationship to the European project is what Brexit is all about. While we can readily acknowledge that all groups, especially those which call themselves nations, offer a story about their own exceptionalism, well, British exceptionalism is exceptional, unlike that of any other European countries. Now, everyone, everyone, many in this room, some of whom I know, historians, sociologists, political scientists, seem to tell us that British exceptionalism is overdetermined by geography, the island thing, history, never invaded thing, political culture, Westminster supreme, or class culture. Britain is very special for its cohort effect, whereby even if you move from the working class to the middle class, you don't graduate away from a certain type of Euroscepticism, for instance. So take all this, shake well, and as a result, polls show that at least since Maastricht, there's been a consistently greater proportion of dislike than like of the EU. It was written in the cards, and this proportion is present nowhere else in the EU. As a result, too, the Brits have even less patience than others in contemplating what they see as Europe's pathologies or dysfunctionality. Now, I thought that British exceptionalism extended to voting behavior. Disproving these Brits, even one of our most solid predictions when we look at elections and referenda, right? Namely that referenda, at least, go both against elites and for the status quo. That was, say, and Bridget and I talked about this before, you know, the Irish no or the French no, voting for the status quo. So why did the British do away? Is that with the status quo? Well, as my friend Sophie Duchesne, who has conducted hundreds of focus interviews in the UK, explains, actually, for a significant portion of the British population, the often heard we are going to Europe is not just an atavistic figure of speech, like for my own other compatriots, the Greeks, pamis in Europa. But that's just semantics. We know we're part of Europe. In fact, we know, don't we, Alex, that we named it, so we are part of it, right? Even though they want to kick us out. So these people Sophie interviewed believe that, well, we're not really in the EU, which after all is the euro, isn't it? So in that part of British exceptionalism, leaving is the status quo. Say the French, the goal was prescient. The Brits are simply not European enough to remain part of this EU. I hate to invoke de Gaulle these days, but there we go. So I did say earlier, though, that of course, with all myths, the story is obviously more complicated. For one, with banishments, who defines the terms of banishment? How far and how close you ought to remain from us? How long will it take to open the doors? Under what condition can you visit paradise from time to time? You know, Cicero may have killed to save the Republic, but Rome decides when and where he goes. Theresa May think she knows what Brexit means. But when other European leaders exclaim the same thing, and that, well, the Brits should get on with it, aren't they trying to enact a much more self-aggrandizing version of the banishment story, where it is they, the European leaders, and they alone who stand at the gates? They are the ones who have agency, not these crazy Brits. Conversely, however, it's not always clear in the banishment story. Which side is worse, the old world you leave or the new world you go to? Is it dispowerment or empowerment? Ask Eve. And whichever it is, what does it truly say about you? There is indeed, do you agree or not, a grudging admiration for the Brits in many quarters in Europe. Bloody-minded, stiff upper-lip Brits, they dared. Would we? Of course, for bad reasons, but they dared. And how do we make sense of the very real possibility that banishment could have been not banishment, that the vote could have gone the other way, if only fill the blanks? That's what we all talk about. If only less lies, better media, expanded right to vote to the 16, 17-year-olds or the over 15-year of expats. Are referenda too crude a reflection of a multifaceted British exceptionalism of which we only retain the dark side? How many true, cosmopolitan we know, Bridget, in Britain, who voted the other way? They could have won. After all, no one would be talking about British exceptionalism in the way we do now if all but 2% of the vote had been reversed. So, indeed, isn't banishment always on a knife's edge? Banishment is all or nothing, but little separates the two. A foolish gamble, a short moment of over-appetite in paradise. Who says that biting the apple was written in the English DNA? If Cicero had not been banished, he would have been the leader of Rome. Or rather, Cicero was banished because if not, he would have been the leader of Rome. So the Remain camp said so. We must lead Europe, not leave Europe. It was their slogan. Just 4 months ago, a slogan that didn't seem so implausible to many on the continent. In fact, many on the continent know that banishment can hurt the banisher at least as much as the banished. That Britain is exceptional also because it's our great balancer in Europe. Of the French on behalf of the German, balance of the German on behalf of the French, and of both of these guys on behalf of the periphery. Unsurprisingly, actually, studies from a group that was very active on the Remain side called British Influence showed that Britain is the most sought-after ally in council negotiations, well, after Germany, obviously. Let's not push the bouchon too far. So, critically, I would argue that the story is not that straightforward because the Brits who feel so British that they want to leave seem to have two radically different ways of not being European enough, à la de Gaulle. One is that some of them find Europe too big, but the others find it too small. We've got the parochials and we've got the globalists in our British exceptionalist constellation. And for other Europeans, it's not clear what versions we kind of dislike more, since each makes us feel a bit more irrelevant, but in a different way. If the Brits have left off because they find Europe too big, we can try to confine the meaning of Brexit to all that is pathetic about British exceptionalism. But hey, they're not the only ones to find Europe too big and ever-expanding and unwieldy and all the rest of it. Now, if they left because they find Europe too small, that's the globalists who want to go and conquer the world all over again. They may be delusional, but it has panache. There's this kind of unconscious fear sometimes in Europe. What if Britain did manage to turn Brexit into a successful experiment in a new version of global cool Britannia powerhood? Oops. Now, turning to the rest of the world, unfortunately for the globalist Brexiters, message sent, at least message sent by them, is not message received. Most of the rest of the world seems to buy the first variant of Brexit exceptionalism. Ah, you are a small island after all. We knew it all along, say the Chinese, but whatever. Now, Bridget knows better than me, as well as Ulrich, with the wonderful Schumann program on Europe in the world, that so many Chinese, Brazilian, South Africans, or Australian seem to think, and I've heard many of them over the summer, seem to think that this is a case of small-mindedness. If British exceptionalism is not soluble in the EU, why would it be on our continent? I kind of quote, how could you be so stupid in the age of globalization, however contested, to banish yourselves from the biggest trade groups on the bloc, a group capable of mustering more bargaining power than anyone else on the international scene, even though it's really, really messy to interact with it. Even the Commonwealth, the darling of the global Brexiters, if you were there, they tend to ask, why should we be deprived of our access to Europe through you? Hey, sorry, Britain, but that's kind of why we were interested in you in the first place these days. And yet, seen from Oxford, where students, researchers, and tourists will surely continue to come malgré tout, unanchored global Britannia does not seem completely implausible after all. So, in the end, on banishment, if you are hard-headed Euro-federalists, hey, this banishment is an old dream come true. Especially if you can throw out the rest of the periphery, you know, the Poles and the Greeks and assorted Romanians, who should never have gotten in the first place. Banishment is kind of the coming back to the natural order of things. We should have stayed cozily 6 among ourselves, or at the most 12, pushing back our European barbarians at the gate. I have heard this not-so-secret sing-song for the last 20 years, above all in Brussels and in Paris. Well, the Italian and the Spaniards, what do you think? Usually they're wavering, depending on whether the big boys signal that they're one of them. And the German usually stay silent, so they can agree with everyone on this and other things. But perhaps for me, the most interesting, really interesting other exceptionalism is that of the Danes, closest to the British psyche, whatever that is, and yet who pulled after Brexit a dramatic increase in support for staying in the EU. What do we make of this? Perhaps when your exceptionalism, Danes, lay with the delights of hygge. For those of you who don't know, hygge is the Danish delight of sitting next to a fire, drinking mulled wine, surrounded by your loved one around and the dogs and the candles and all the rest of it. So perhaps if that's your ultimate version of your national exceptionalism, stepping out alone in the cold is a step too far. So ultimately, Brexit means that exceptionalism in Europe, for sure, is no exception, but that the special brand of exceptionalism has given Britain a special role. That would be the role of canary in the mine, the canary that tells us that we are indeed in danger in the mine. So this brings us to our second archetype. Here, please shift your gaze from the little island at the tip of a continent, coyly retreating from its shore, within its shores, to the continent as a whole. Itself the small tip of the Asian landmass, a continent, our continent, submerged by one seismic wave after another. Tsunami wave, each coming on stronger before we've even had time to absorb the aftershock of the preceding wave. In this story, in this archetypal myth, Europeans need to read Brexit as a revealer of terribly uncomfortable truths. Denial would be the only reason Europeans hang on to the exceptionalist story. So as meaning drifts to the category of reckoning, Brexit is no longer about Britain, but it's about the EU itself. Brexit means that everyone should leave, abandon the ship. We hear. Or do we hear? The British electorate is only the messenger, the flyer. Brexit's message to the world is that the EU is no longer a space one should want to join, the power of attraction, but a space one should want to leave, the power of repulsion. Brexit, proclaim Eurosceptics of all shades, is about the fate that is awaiting the EU. Brexit only serves to make it visible, blindingly visible, as Oedipus would say. And of course, the story of reckoning tells us that Brexit is not a tsunami coming from nowhere, but on one of our own making, a great punishment for some great past deed. It tells us that the EU is being punished somehow, less for what it has done than for what it has failed to do. Deal with globalization, unfair competition, refugee and uncontrolled migration, the suffering of the poor, and the free riding of the rich. So with Brexit, the specter of disintegration has become real and institutionalized in procedures, article numbers 50, and summit agenda. And we are even starting to have disintegration studies coming as a footnote to our integration studies and scholarship. So Euroscepticism is now not only in power in some of the EU capitals, but able somehow to command the very boundaries of Europe, a core marker of our collective identity, if there is such a thing. And it has transformed every domestic theater, from Marine Le Pen to Geert Wilders, into a local battle for the survival of the whole of Europe. But of course, this archetype of reckoning and the last judgment is no more straightforward than that of banishment. For one, that truth that must be faced by the EU, as the meaning of Brexit, is a very elusive affair. Who is to say what these uncomfortable truths are? Oedipus was always going to kill his dad and marry his mom, but for what reason? Who failed to heal the prophecy? The parents who wavered at the birth, the maid who wavered at the river, he who failed to read the signs. As the paradigmatic seeker and avoider of truth, Oedipus both very deliberately solved the riddle by the Sphinx and very accidentally fulfilled the prophecy. So can Freud's "What have I done?" ever be redeemed by acknowledging that the truth is blindingly obvious? Secondly, of course, reckonings do come in different shapes and form. Some believe in indiscriminate reckoning, and others that it's all in the sorting out of the worthy and the sinners. Perhaps EU reform is still possible, skepticism not a destruction. Some believe that we have agency in the story, that the faster EU leaders let go of the exceptionalist story, the more likely they are to cushion the reckoning. And some believe that actually, hey, it might be bad, but the last judgment will never happen. Brexit means that the EU now lives in a state of permanent ontological insecurity, in the shadow of the last judgment, forever postponed and forever possible. For reckoning is a conjunction. Everyone will pay because everyone should pay. But in this interstice between injunction and prediction, the slim possibility of turning conjunction into disjunction, in that interstice lies all of our human hope, fears, and gamble. Which takes us back to Brexit, and where meaning does arrive from explanation. If Brexit is the canary in the mine, what does it tell us? To hugely simplify, here again there is a contradiction, a tension. We need to wrap our heads around two rather different magnetic poles, which, while exceptionally powerful in Britain, are undoubtedly, I would say, pan-European. The poles of these many skepticism arrayed between existential skepticism and reformist, closed and open, right-wing and left-wing. So to hugely simplify, we face a different kind of reckoning depending on whose voice prevail. What skepticism we're talking about between those who voted against Brussels for London and those who voted against London through Brussels. These are two very different things. The operative word is for both sovereignty, but the reckoning is a very different affair if the EU has sinned against national or popular sovereignty. So to be sure, if we consider against Brussels for London, it would be a mistake to relegate those who voted such, or for that matter, for Paris or Budapest, only to the purgatory of retrograde sovereignism. It is that too. It is, of course, in its most extreme form, that good old nationalism that Europe was built to forget forever. But concerns about sovereignty must be taken seriously when they mean local autonomy. Indeed, take back control. was the most powerful slogan imaginable. When I heard the slogan last January, I was almost sure that we'd lost. What a brilliant slogan. One that I had heard for the last 15 years in the streets of Paris, Amsterdam, Dublin, and Athens during every EU referendum campaign. So if reckoning deals in the currency of time, EU actors must acknowledge the longue durée between deed and judgment, that somehow for many, the struggle against universal domination is an old story in Europe, which of course Boris Johnson's clumsy reminder about Hitler should not make us forget nevertheless. Reckoning should mean to act in conformity with the fact that the EU was not built to transcend the nation state, but to tame and open the sovereign. It was built to respect national social contracts and acknowledge that respect for shared rules dealing with our externalities and the rule of law must ultimately be constructed from within, in Warsaw today or in Rome tomorrow. Greece may have become Brussels' dead colony, in the words of my friend, the current foreign minister, but the keys are still in Athens. So there is a reckoning about national sovereignty. But this we must contrast with the other side, that is even harder to dismiss, the Euroscepticism which votes against London through Brussels, but that's secondary. Accordingly, of course, democracy was not in the EU's DNA, and that this original sin might have been a necessary sin, but it can no longer stay unheeded. People will use a vote against Brussels to vote against their own political elites because they understand that the EU has been an enabler of elite collusion, or they think they understand, allowing the political class across Europe to escape domestic political constraints, hide behind EU law and decision. And in this view, legal ayatollahs in Brussels and the liberal elites in the capitals made a Faustian bargain, exchanging self-government and popular sovereignty at national level for liberal constitutionalism at the EU level. And from there, it is not too hard to get to where we are, what Bridget has called in her work coercive integration. So in short, the anti-elite backlash, that is one of the meanings of Brexit, it may be worldwide, but Europeans' elite are top of the class, having managed to build the infamous Weberian iron cage of bureaucracy. I had to quote Weber today. An iron cage out of reach of any electoral cycle, something I have called in the past an iron cage in a bubble, the Brussels bubble. Now, it's hard to wrap your head around that metaphor, but you can try. Fascinatingly, I would add, a recent poll tells us that the more the people distrust the elites, the more the elites themselves seem to trust each other. There's an inverse correlation here. Huddled in their own lifeboat, these elites drift in the mistaken belief that the reckoning is simply part of the false consciousness that has beset the oi polloi, an ungrateful lot that fails to acknowledge what we have done for them, and that our Brussels conspiracy is truly for their own good, there to deliver public goods. That precisely because these are public, cannot be left to the public's whims. This is where populist politicians and technocrats, at least of the old kind, meet, each proclaiming that there is but one true people or true general interest, and that they alone can know, enact, or represent it. So, let's not be too doomsayer. If this last judgment is not the last judgment, what is to be done? Without assuming that skepticism has captured the public imagination everywhere across member states, Can't we agree that the Eurosphere will ignore the prophecy at its own peril until unraveling makes it blindingly obvious? Yes, we do have existential skepticism, which puts into question the very existence of the EU. But we also have transformative skepticism, which may or may not believe, depending on who you speak to, that reform is still possible, that it's still on the card, or that it's too late. So we do have skepticism about the EU's raison d'être, as opposed to skepticism about the EU's way of being. And these are radically different skepticism, and we need to recognize, perhaps, that the surest road to radical EU reform in the reckoning story is to fend off one skepticism, existential, and embrace transformative skepticism. EU rules must pass the same test. From the ECJ rulings to the injunction of structural reform by the Troika, they must be democratically and domestically sustainable. Not closed, not because we look at closed and self-centered democracies in Europe, but because we have one based on the patient, long-term social construction of a democratic ethos based on the sharing of popular sovereignty, radical opening to one another, including when we hold referendum, but still based on national democracies. Now, I could tell you about the myth of air, where Plato concludes that only love of wisdom can break the cycle of reward and punishment. And I would ask ourselves, can the EU become wise? Can we all convert to generalized, kind of benign skepticism to avoid Armageddon? After all, we all in this room should call ourselves Eurosceptic, if only because we pretend to peddle in knowledge. That is the acknowledgement that there is no truth of the matter, only the quest and the critical virtues of suspended judgment and systemic doubt. Now, we still want to ask, what does the narrative of reckoning mean for the rest of the world? I've heard quite a lot of schadenfreude, where Brexit means that Europeans have now lost for good their self-entitlement as gatekeepers, adjudicating standards of civilization yesterday, and the rest of the world hasn't forget standards of cooperation today. As a reckoning for the entire West, Brexit puts into question the very idea of rules-based international system with their go it alone. Revisionist powers of all reaches of the globe unite. That might be the meaning of Brexit. But then, Schadenfreude, yes, but I've also heard much post-Brexit bitterness from those who are hurt by European skepticism, whose effort at peace building from East Asia to the Middle East continue to be inspired by the story of reconciliation, turning bitter enemies into neighbors and neighbors into friends. Reckoning for them means trouble. And I've heard concerns and hope in equal measures from Britain's former colonies in Sudan, Sierra Leone, Lesotho, Myanmar, Sri Lanka, that Brexit could possibly mean exchanging their old metropole for Brussels. And is that better or worse? Who's the bigger bully? Okay, this brings us to our third narrative, my pet one, of course, namely pluralism or Brexit as sacrifice. I want to start here on this final narrative and myth with what I do not mean. A month before the referendum, Jean Quatremer, you know him, Libération's veteran Brussels correspondent, and perhaps the most co-opted of them all, penned an editorial entitled Le Brexit, un sacrifice pour sauver l'Europe, where he implored the Brits to have courage and vote leave, not because it was in their interest, it wasn't, but for Europe's sake. That is because the alternative would be unbearable. If you win the referendum, David Cameron, you will be the only one to have been capable of winning a national referendum on the EU, and will thus find yourself at the center of European games. And that would be terrible. Lui et ses successeurs, I have to quote in French, négocieront concession après concession pour enterrer totalement le rêve fédéraliste des pères de l'Europe et achever la transformation du vieux continent en une zone de libre-échange de plus en plus molle. Tout espoir d'un rebond européen sera définitivement enterré. I kind of know this French line by heart, but it does tell us that only with the Leave vote will the other governments take the risks that they should have taken all along, more transfers of sovereignty. And in short, if Iphigenia does not die burned at the stake, we will never reach Troy and the Promised Land. Now, you know, Quatremer does admit that this would be the fourth time the Brits have come to do the rescue of Europe's divided tribes. But for him, it just means that, hey guys, the Brits, you've been in the business of sacrifice long enough. Do the deed one more time and leave us among ourselves. But of course, this discourse is central to the hard Brexiters too. Boris Johnson repeated it just recently. Brexit will be good for you Europeans. We're the nice guys. Now you can integrate in peace. He doesn't quite put it as sacrifice, to be a bit contradictory, but the story is the same. Goodbye le veto anglais, Brexit is salutary. Now, if you've gotten my drift by now, you will recognize here not the true archetype of sacrifice, but the more comfortable one of banishment. For what Quatremer seems to forget is that in most stories of sacrifice, the sacrificial victim is not the bad guy. And it is its executors who must own up. Clytemnestra saw to it that Agamemnon would pay for sacrificing Iphigenia, their daughter. And Stannis Baratheon is executed after losing his great battle by no other than Lady Brienne of Tarth. What is it with these strong women with daggers that exercise Guy writer's mind? Now, nor is it clear that an unworthy sacrifice will be carried through. Remember Iphigenia's goat. So if we are to explore the meaning of Brexit as sacrifice, I am much more interested in a narrative which attaches itself to the essence of the EU, in the way in which we generally try to think about success from failure. Brexit, there, is not a flair for something that will happen to the world, reckoning, something about the EU. In fact, it is something more about the essence of the Union, an essence defined by the way in which you may leave it. This intuition was really clear during the 2002 European Convention, when the possibility of an exit article was introduced. As a participant, I remember finding myself really shocked by the passionate opposition from self-described Europhiles who saw Article 50 as a sovereignist plot. For traditionalist Euro-federalists, proper states generally, do not have prenups. Even the UK had to improvise a secessionist vote, and in allowing it, it was the exception. Introducing an exit clause in European treaties means that once and for all, the EU would never cross the Rubicon to become a proper state, as did the US in 1865. Now, that was the kind of vibes on the convention floor, but a number of us rebelled against what I called at the time the tyranny of dichotomies, sovereignism, federalism, and passionately defended the very idea of exit as the key to a third way for Europe, a narrative about the EU as not a federal state, but a federal union, for which I called at the time the term demoicracy, demoi the plural of demos, a union of peoples who govern together but not as one, and remain together by choice. We'll discuss this much more tomorrow. So obviously, so I was a great fan and kind of participated in the writing of Article 50 for my sins. And obviously, what we support in theory, we don't always have to support in practice. I never dreamed at the time that my country of adoption, Britain, would oblige and sacrifice so much for the sake of proving a point. But few have noted this obvious contradiction in the pro-leave rhetoric in Britain. If the EU is a terrible superstate leviathan clipping Britain's sovereign wings, how can it be so easy to secede? This is what I call, the Brexit paradox. So here, the real meaning of Brexit should be to demonstrate that this is a union that you can leave, and that therefore it is this very freedom to leave it that ought to entice you to stay. You can leave, and therefore you shouldn't. Those married among you will get the drift here. Now, and IRist among you, IR theorist among you, might think of this as a kind of positive deterrence theory. The now credible, with Brexit, promise that you can leave makes it less likely that countries will leave. The success of its credibility is that it will not be actualized, just like nuclear deterrence. So the irony of this story of sacrifice for the sake of a more pluralist EU, unfortunately, is that it requires the sacrifice of perhaps the most pluralist country of them all, and that a true pluralist Europe would be fit for the purpose of accommodating every view of exceptionalism, including of the British variety. Be that as it may, we are where we are. British exceptionalism can still be considered as a resource in this positive narrative of sacrifice if we consider that the meaning of Brexit does not lie only with the whether it can happen, whether you can leave, but how it happens, and probably how it happens for much longer than 2 years. There are indeed just and unjust ways of leaving, depending, to be short, on whether they betray what I would call responsible pluralism, something our colleague Chris Lord has written about. If we are to play the part of awesome Iphigenia, we in the UK must recover those bits of British exceptionalism that will serve this responsible pluralism, stubborn adherence to legal commitments, very un-Italian, or the ethos of Her Majesty's loyal opposition. These are the bits of British pluralism, British exceptionalism, that would serve the story. And as Chris recently argued, existing states need to live in ways that respect their obligations to their own publics in a pluralist vision. And they cannot do so without drawing from the resources provided by the cooperative whole. 4 decades of co-creation of the new legal and political order that is the EU means that this EU is no longer what it would have been without the UK. And it means that contrary to the hard Brexiters' dream of the easy Brexit that only cost a postage stamp to send a letter to Brussels, you cannot choose to leave unilaterally which bits you can stay out, but also which bits you can stay in, as with their beloved Indian independence option. You know, India took on all of the British laws when it became independent. With freedoms comes responsibility. Now, that's for Britain and the way of leaving. But if we turn to the EU, an EU chastened by the long shadow of reckoning might perhaps rediscover the true virtue of pluralism in this meaning of Brexit, not to bow to fears or the need to placate the Eurosceptics, but to live up to the meaning of this sacrifice. Agamemnon's troop must conquer Troy, and the EU must live up to the premise of a union by choice. If Brexit is to mean that the freedom to leave defines the very essence of a pluralist EU, the EU must evolve to make exit less palatable ex ante rather than punish it ex post. Call this, if you will, exit interruptus. This means refining all the various proxies for exit that our creative, legal, and political minds, including in this room, can offer. The most extreme pluralist might advocate that the EU embrace what my colleague Helen Margetts, who heads Oxford's Internet Institute, calls chaotic pluralism, where the glue that holds the whole together comes under the sexy labels of network effects, decentralized intelligence, heterogeneity management, nonlinearity, high interconnectivity, making this model far more disorganized and unpredictable than the architects of pluralist, neo-pluralist, or revisionist model ever envisaged, to be sure. So, a bit scary perhaps, chaotic pluralism. But I do like these ideas, above all because in the process, the EU could become more radically open to the new generations with their mode of open political activism and participation. We can talk about Echo's chamber. These new generations who, if they had been given the vote on Brexit, would have given it a totally different meaning. Britain would still be in. But in the here and now, forget chaotic pluralism. Exit interruptus can avail itself to a more traditional approach. And of course, it can be about turning the EU into a club of clubs, a la Mayonnaise, where clubs would be formed along functionalist rather than territorial line. But on this, I worry that under such a scenario, our European democracy, which is one polity united in diversity, would lose its common core. However many exceptional demoi, our shared kratos in Europe requires togetherness. A pluralist will, if you want, but at least together on the big issues that connect us with the rest of the world, climate, trade, security, etc. Better, in my view, to pursue more subtle forms of exit interruptus through differentiated integration, a topic dear to the heart of Richard Bellamy, who I'm sure applies this beautifully in practice in his leadership of the Max Weber Institute. Fundamentally, differentiation stems from interpreting the requirements of equality through sophisticated doctrines, Aristotelian no less, of non-discrimination. For if discrimination is a different treatment that results in a disadvantage, it obviously follows that an equal treatment, if it does result in a disadvantage, must discriminate to treat different people equally. Differentiated integration ought to be the EU response to the British-like propensity to over-apply common laws and to become overburdened from their unequal effects. Read Free Movement of People. Perhaps, just perhaps, we might then envisage enticing the sacrificial scapegoat back close enough to the fold of a renewed and pluralist continental partnership, as envisaged recently by the Bruegel crowd. And finally, as far as the rest of the world is concerned, if the EU is able to embrace a philosophy of radical, if not chaotic, pluralism, we also need to give once and for all, to give up ideas of Europe as a model, obsession with one voice, and our resort to othering to build our sense of identity, as any old nation state has done. So if we do so, the rest of the world is more likely to receive British sacrifice not as a sign of weakness and decline, but as a sign of Europe's continued relevance as a fascinating, if flawed, experiment in pluralist transnational governance. So, to conclude, and I know, Bridget, I've run out of time, but to conclude, let me preemptively defend myself for my use of myth in helping us navigate the meanings of Brexit from exceptionalism to skepticism and pluralism. By invoking archetypal myth, I could easily be accused by the philosophers among you of ignoring 1,500 years of political philosophy, which developed precisely as anti-myth, the commitment to advancing propositions that can be assessed critically, falsified, and replaced, from Plato to Popper's urgent post-war appeal to reason. But we cannot ignore either that the pushback from the likes of Adorno and his enlightenment as myth, Jung and myth as reflecting these collective unconscious, etc., from the many disciplines of psychology, sociology, anthropology, all seek to understand the particular through universal structures of human consciousness. For my defense, I have sought to use the power of myth not to sell you an enchanted version of Brexit, nor even to provide you with a menu, 3 meanings of Brexit among which you might want to choose or you're already chosen. Rather, my take rests on the hope that we can reinvent ways of conducting our democratic conversation. Myths are not top-down constructs, but resources for bottom-up reconstruction and connecting political imaginaries and democratic praxis. At one and the same time, myth appeal to people's fundamental intuitions, countering or at least supplementing the Habermasian idea of democracy as deliberative rationality. Not because people cannot be rational, but because to be so together in Europe, as Philip Bonfarish so brilliantly demonstrated in his book on language, we do need common languages across our linguas, our disciplines, our ideologies, our national culture. A language in which we can more fruitfully disagree. In order to disagree on whether Brexit is good or bad, about losers or winners, and European pathology, we must have words to say what it is. But at the same time, agonistic politics remind us of the incommensurability of values, the importance of not feeling compelled to resolve tensions and differences among us. Paradoxically, I would say, thinking through the prism of myth may help us recover the recul of modernity by supporting a critical distance and collective self-reflectiveness, by providing a shared language for, after all, a certain irony we have acquired with modernity when it comes to myth. So this is another way of saying that myths contain within them their own epistemic limits, at least for our contemporary eyes. And they remind us that ambivalence is our birthright, not just as individuals, but as collectives and as nations. So if you force me to conclude for good, to put my cards on the table, let me say this. For my children's sake, I do hope that the bright side of British exceptionalism will continue to enliven our European debate, and that their self-banishment will not last forever. I do hope that the right kind of Euroscepticism might prevail in the EU, and that our elites will realize that conspiracy among themselves will only make them forever more deaf to the voices of the European demo. And for Europe's sake, I do think that with half of the British voters and 2/3 of its under 24 voting for Remain, Brexit is a sacrifice that might not last forever. I do hope that Europeans would follow Michelle Obama's injunction to take the high ground and collectively address with intelligence and humility the challenge of the various meanings of Brexit. And if this happens in the next 10 years, the UK sacrifice would not have been in vain, not because, as they say in France, plus de veto, but because, like Iphigenia, she will have allowed a new Odyssey to unfold. And under this optimistic scenario, we may yet take a leaf from another Greek mythical figure, that of Penelope, who unweaved at night her day's labor while awaiting Ulysses. But hopefully we will do it the other way around. We can count on our heroic Brexiters in London to frantically unweave the ties that bind in broad daylight. But perhaps, just perhaps, the spirit of pan-European mutual recognition will linger forcefully enough here in Britain, there in Britain, and everywhere, so that when they, the Brexiters, are not looking, we will continue to weave and reweave the fabric of our shared future. Thank you.